Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Today's episode, the ideological capture of mental health, a whistleblower's story. We are talking about how the phrase decolonize healing has become a weapon of social engineering. So I first introduced this idea that people leave a high-control religion thinking they found freedom only to land in another rigid belief system on the episode called Escaping One Cult, Joining Another, the Trap of Ideological Echo Chambers, when cult recovery looks a lot like a new cult. And today, we're diving even deeper. Like, why does this happen? Well, because humans are tribal. Political scientists have long found that our opinions are shaped more by group identity than by rational self-interest. As Jonathan Haidt explains in The Righteous Mind, politics are deeply tribal. We're hardwired to align with groups, and our morality will bind and blind us. It does not necessarily offer truth, but it definitely provides a sense of belonging. And as I've been navigating the deconstruction, ex-Christian, ex-cult communities, I've noticed for many, the radical progressive left has become their new safe community, offering a clear moral hierarchy, the oppressed versus the oppressor, privileged versus the marginalized, and it mirrors what they once found in their faith. And here's the problem. The partisan brain is already trained in us versus them, and it doesn't become freer. It just simply finds a new orthodoxy. John McWhorter argued that woke ideology functions like a religion. Instead of original sin, there's privilege, marking some people as morally compromised from birth. Instead of prayer, there's public confession of biases and activism as penance. And instead of heaven, there's a utopia achieved through systemic change. Yes, this framework offers a sense of moral clarity and belonging, but just like any other fundamentalist movement, it cannot and will not tolerate dissent. As McWhorter warns, what we are seeing isn't a quest for justice, but a demand for unquestioning orthodoxy. And that is why the deconstruction ex-Christian space looks less like healing and more like indoctrination. I mean, you hear the words systemic racism, oppression, intersectionality, and these words, man, they dominate the language in trauma recovery and social justice activism, but what do they really mean? If you take them at face value, you might think that we're fighting discrimination or ensuring equal opportunity. But if you really listen and you really follow the ideology to its core, it all comes back to one thing: capitalism. For the radical left, capitalism isn't just an economic system. It is the system, the root of all oppression, the force that creates every hierarchy, every disparity, every injustice. When they say systemic racism, they do not mean individual prejudice or even discriminatory laws. They actually mean the entire capitalist structure that in their view was built to privilege some and exploit others. And here's the part that's honestly exhausting for me. Watching the same deconstruction folks preach about decolonizing healing and Christian nationalism in the same breath while pushing trauma support for religious survivors while being knee-deep in critical race theory. It's one thing to acknowledge past harms, okay? But this ideology just piles on more depression and anxiety, and it's damaging to our way of life in America without offering real solutions. So let's get real. This isn't about healing. It is just more of the same toxic division and victimhood repackaged as victimhood. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I've got receipts. Just listen to this clip from my interview last season with Catherine Spearing, the founder of Tears of Eden, a nonprofit supporting survivors of spiritual abuse. When she said it on the podcast, I was literally shook. And I was just like smiling and nodding, fawning. Couldn't believe she said it. And then I was shook up. I didn't even know if I wanted to air the entire episode at all, but I ended up just cutting a lot of it out and I dropped it nonetheless. And I'm glad that I'm actually putting it out there because this needs to be said. Here's the clip.
And like one of the things that I have committed to listen to white men podcasts. I don't listen to white men on TV. I don't listen to white men's sermons. I don't read white men's books. I miss zero things by not listening to white men. Like, there is amazing material created by BIPOC, AAPI people, queer identifying people, women. Like, I miss zero things by not listening to white men. And we as a culture, and especially fundamentalist culture, has platformed white men as voices of authority and trust.
Now let's take Nikki G. Speaks, who also works with Tears of Eden. Her new ebook frames Christian nationalism as the root of systemic oppression, defining it in a way that casts anyone with conservative values or moral convictions as complicit. And it's really not just an argument. This is packaged as trauma recovery. Here's how it's marketed. Hearing the same controlling language in our laws that I first heard in church feels like a step backward in my healing. And it's like my trauma has left the church and entered our government. It's a reminder of how pervasive these beliefs can be. This isn't about healing. This is about turning political disagreement into personal trauma. And these are just a few examples of how therapy spaces are being used to enforce ideology rather than foster true recovery and dialogue. Let this sink in. This is what's being promoted under the guise of healing. This is not about liberation. This is about swapping one dogma for another, one form of control for another. And you know what the worst part? This stuff is being fed to people who are already deeply wounded, offering them more alienation, more resentment instead of real recovery. And this is actually where intersectionality comes in. Coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s, intersectionality originally described how many different forms of discrimination, like race, gender, class, could compound or, build on top of one another. And now, in the hands of modern activists, it's become something so much broader. It is now a blueprint for how capitalism oppresses everyone. Race, capitalism's fault. Gender, a hierarchy created by capitalism. Police, they're a tool for capitalism to protect property and maintain order. Disability, even that, they argue, is a social construct through a capitalist framework that determines who's productive and who isn't. The goal isn't reform, it's destruction. Private property, free markets, law enforcement, and even objective truth itself. Everything is viewed as an extension of capitalism's oppressive grip. And because the U.S. Constitution protects that system, it too is labeled as a racist, colonist document that must be overturned. And this is why, no matter what progress is made, America will always be deemed a racist society by those who see racism and capitalism as forever linked. And if you think this sounds extreme, you just wait, because the next frontier, queer Marxism, is going to take this even further. The emerging ideology argues that capitalism didn't just create economic classes, but it created gender itself. That masculinity and femininity are not just cultural norms, but capitalist inventions designed to uphold oppression. And their radical goal is not just to redefine gender, but honestly to abolish it entirely. And so today, I am joined by someone who saw this ideology take over firsthand. Suzannah Alexander is the writer behind Diogenes in Exile and a self-described whistleblower. Her journey took a sharp turn when she returned to grad school to pursue a master's in clinical mental health counseling at the University of Tennessee. And instead of a rigorous academic environment, she found a program completely entrenched in critical race theory, one that didn't just push radical ideas, but actively rejected her Buddhist practice and raised serious ethical concerns about how future therapists were being trained. Believing the curriculum was going to do more harm than good, she made the difficult decision to leave. Since then, Suzannah has dedicated herself to investigating and exposing the ideological capture of psychology, higher education, and other institutions that seem to have lost their way. Today, we're going to be pulling back the curtain on what's really happening in academia and the mental health field, and how radical ideologies are shaping the next generation of therapists, and what this means for all of us, because this is not just about politics. This is about the fundamental reshaping of how we think about identity, human nature, and even reality itself. You better buckle up, because this conversation is going to challenge some assumptions. Let's get into it. Listeners, I am here with Suzannah Alexander, and I am so grateful you took the time to join us today. Would you please just kick off the conversation, sharing a little bit about your background, your story, brought you, to be sitting down in front of us today?
Well, I came to counseling. I guess that's where my story starts here, is I came to counseling fresh off divorce, going back to work, or that was my intent, to go back to work after having been a stay-at-home parent for 25 years. And I, after a lot of consideration and reflecting on what I had, some of the skills that I had learned as a stay-at-home parent, I decided that I thought that it would be a good fit to be a counselor. And I went back and I discovered that the counseling field was untethered to what I would have thought was the principles of psychology that have been, built on for over 100 years. And it had become an ideological circus where they're trying to indoctrinate people to these ideas that just make people's mental health way worse. And I ended up experiencing a lot of resistance, in part to my Buddhist practice and just my general attitudes and beliefs and, the way that I am generally in the world. And I went through a support plan, and by the end of the semester, I was done. And I came out, and after I recovered a bit, I have been speaking out about it ever since, and trying to let people know and get the word out, finding different ways to push back against this ideology, because for all that it is supposed to be improving people's mental health, I think it does absolutely the opposite. I think these training programs are creating people who can't help but do malpractice with their clients.
And we're going to dive more into that, because you have gotten a fire lit and have done some serious research in reviewing a lot of materials to try to see, your own personal experience, which we'll talk more about the support plan. And I can relate to that, because you're like, what happened here? It's almost like you had to put the puzzle pieces together in your research and then explain to the rest of us, because a lot of us, like we've mentioned, the coddling of American mind on this podcast, we're seeing this victimhood, those three untruths, that your feelings are fact. We're seeing that as a society, and we're wondering, where does this come from? So not only does it come from academia, but it's coming from the social sciences, coming from the leadership there, but it's coming from the counselor and the education there. And so will you share a little bit before we dive into you wrote a 5-part article series on Substack, which they're all linked in the show notes, guys. We're going to be talking about each one. But before we dive into that, will you share specifically a little bit more about your Buddhist, it's not much as a faith practice, but more about your beliefs? Because that's something I find really interesting, that the fact that it was not palatable for them is really alarming to me.
Yeah, that was something that just really, it still kind of blows me away that is something that was that they took issue with at all, given that Buddhism is the underlying philosophy behind dialectical behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. I just, for most of the semester, I assumed that I must have explained it poorly, because I'm going to one class and they're saying you shouldn't be thinking that way, and then I'm going to another class and they're saying you should teach people to think that way, and it's like, okay, I'm so confused. But it started very early in the semester. We were having a brief discussion about how therapists might manage their feelings when they were confronted with a client who was kind of pushing their buttons. And I offered to the class that, a way that you can manage that is it happens to be the central practice of Buddhism, which is called the doctrine of the non-self. But you reduce your focus on, and I used the word identity. Maybe if I had used the word ego, it would not have been a big deal. But I used, you can reduce your focus on your identity, and then look at your interactions through the lens of your values, like who you want to be. Like that whole thing that Gandhi would say, be the change you wish to see in the world. And you do that by, instead of reacting to what's happening to you, you just take it in, and then you ask yourself, well, how do I want to respond to this? I can feel myself getting really angry. How do I want to respond? And I was told, well, immediately one of the other students in my class piped up and called me out and said, it's a privilege not to have to think about your identity. And I was like, that's really strange. And like, that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But I just, it's like I noted it, but I just kind of put that over to the side. And then later on, my professor, right after class broke up, he said that thinking practice could be considered invalidating to other identities. And I was just really confused by that. That made no sense to me. Like, he might as well have said something like, it's like your thinking practice makes me want to eat bananas, and it's like it made no sense at all. Later on, another professor who had not been at that class came up to me and said that my thinking practice was harmful and, could be harmful to clients and my other students, and that it was invalidating, this language of being invalidating to other identities. And I just, I assumed that I must not have explained it well, because the doctrine of the non-self it's kind of an esoteric, arcane sort of thing. And while I have gotten, I think, a lot better at putting it into words, it was at the time not something that I was accustomed to explaining to other people. So I was just thoroughly at a loss, and I ended up in my advisor's room for something else. And I brought that up, and my advisor said that, well, that would have been fine a few years ago, but that kind of thinking that's not fine anymore. You can't do that. And I'm just like, really? And I just, I assumed that maybe they weren't making the connection. I was really thrown, because I expected a program that was associated or teaching things that were already in alignment with Buddhism. They must have known. And like, if they're not making the connection, it must be that I'm not explaining it right, because they had to have known. That was my thinking. And because it never would have occurred to me that they would just have decided that that's really bad and you shouldn't do that anymore, because that's just kind of crazy. I mean, not only is that not good in terms of mental health, but it would be unconstitutional in that, and it would never occur to me in that sort of position for me to take those kind of liberties with somebody else. So that's how that played out. It was a nightmare. And, it just still blows me away.
I can imagine. And I appreciate you sharing that. I'm sorry that you went through that. And then in turn, you're using, I'm sure it was enraging, upsetting at times. And what I like about your courage now, being a whistleblower, is the root word of courage is rage. So it's this constructive form of anger, is being courageous and sharing, because you don't have to. You could have moved on with your life. You didn't have to do this, but you did. And I appreciate that you did. And I think our listeners will appreciate it. So let's kick it off, because this kind of ties into what you were speaking about it being unconstitutional. Because in part 1 article, you highlight how the ACA Code of Ethics presents autonomy as a core value, while pushing this collectivist mission that prioritizes societal goals over individual client well-being or individual client's worldview, perhaps. So could you describe that a little bit? And you said it was a shell game in the article, which I thought was spot on. So can you break that down for us, please?
Yes. And I'm trying to, let me pull that up so that I can make
Yes.
sure that I can quote from parts of it, because to really get a feel for what's happening here, you want to look at what the language is in terms of how they're breaking things down and what they call their core values. I take issue with how they define core values versus principles, and I'm aware that there's a little bit of I guess controversy about what you would call a value or a principle. But for me, your values are things that are intangible, like humility. That's not concrete. And for me, a principle is how you would apply that, so like if you were looking at it in terms of if the value was honesty or truthfulness, you would the principle to support that would be, I'm not going to tell lies. There does need to, in a larger scope, there does need to be texture to that. There are occasions where it is appropriate and even more correct to say lies or to tell lies, but that's where you have a set of priorities. But the way that the ACA's Code of Ethics is written, it starts out, the very first things that it writes are these core values. And I think for most people, the interpretation would be that what you put at the top is what should be the priority, but they never really explicitly say this is the priority. And so there's I think that builds in a certain amount of confusion. But what it has listed as its core values are things like enhancing human development through the lifespan. Okay. And so like I look at that and it's like, I'm thinking, how would I, define that as a value? What's the value enhancing? Like if you wanted to like bring that down to a word, which you could, you might say human flourishing. You support flourishing, maybe that might be, but it's so wordy and it's so long. It's not a value that you can really hang on to. It comes across as more of a directive. So it comes across more like, this is what you need to do. You need to support enhancing human development through the lifespan. And then, it really comes off the rails in the next couple where it says, number 2 is honoring diversity and embracing a multicultural approach in support of worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of people within their social and cultural context. Okay. Like that's so far from a value. Like just, the way that it is written, everything about it is not, I mean, like you can value the components of that, but there's so many components in that explanation. It's really a hard thing to latch onto. At the same time, that is what is put up at the top as these are our most important things. So if that's how you're structuring things, you're saying that this is a higher priority. And so by the time you get down to where they're talking about what they're calling their core principles, and that's where they drop autonomy. And then they just to give this little definition of it, autonomy or fostering the right to control the direction of one's life. You've already placed that in the context of honoring diversity. So how much autonomy do you have if you already have to accept this worldview where you're honoring diversity and embracing a multicultural approach? Clearly, they're saying you do not have autonomy over that value. And the problem with the whole multicultural honoring diversity and all of that is the concept is incoherent. It's as incoherent as the statement that they've put here. What does it mean to embrace a multicultural approach? What does anybody know? Can anybody summarize that in, like a sentence? I don't think so.
It's like saying, we're unified in our diversity. And it's like, that doesn't work out.
Right. Yeah. It's absolutely incoherent. And, you can try and throw some language on it and, make it make sense. But what they're saying is, when you take it in its totality, what they're saying is anything goes except for what we say is bad.
Right. Which that double standard is really frustrating. So let's play, maybe not devil's advocate, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, why, we live in a cultural stirring pot, that understands like where there's the bright side of this, like where are their intentions going and where has it fallen out of that? Because what I'm trying to say is you are a counselor. You're obviously going to be working with people who don't share the same worldview as you do, right? Is that where they're trying to set those standards are? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to ask?
Well, if I look at the history, I think that was the thought, and the United States is a culture that has typically been a place that welcomes viewpoints from all over the world and people from all over the world. Yes. And it's reasonable to assume that is probably going to continue into the future. And so I think that may have been part of that belief at the time. And I'm thinking back to where multiculturalism was brought into counseling, and this goes back to 1988. At the same time, if you look at those documents from around 1988, there also seems to be and not necessarily wrongly, but they're looking and they're seeing the people that are coming to to therapy look a lot like the people who are providing the therapy. So there was criticism at the time that many therapists were, young white women, which, that's what you would expect in that sort of profession at that time. And that was, they were getting a similar clientele, and they wanted to be appealing to a more diverse market. And they're, part of the thinking was that, well, maybe if they had counselors that looked like them, they would be more likely to come. And so if it had stopped there, it probably would have been okay. But I think where it went off the rails was assuming that what needed to happen was to change and add this multicultural worldview. But if I'm being, generous in how it got there, if I'm being most generous, I think that it was primarily to try and help ease some of those burdens. But I gotta say, I do feel a little bit like I'm pretzeling myself, just, having read the language. Yeah, having read the language of what they're saying back in 1988, even at that time, they were saying that they thought that this was going to be a benefit to society, not to the individual clients. So I think a lot of this really, if we're being totally honest, started from a standpoint that they had reached a point where they feel like, well, I understand how the world works and I know how to fix it, and this is what we need to do. And they just went with it. And, I think you can make readings of it that make it seem a little nicer. Like, we did this because we wanted people to feel more comfortable. We wanted there to be less racism. And perhaps for some of the individuals who bought into it early, that was their feeling. But that's not what the language at the time said. And that's certainly not how it has developed over time.
Right.
As time has gone by, they've more doubled down to the intent of the original language than to mellow it out and broaden it so that they, kind of put the brakes on that and said, hey, we just want everybody to feel like they're welcome here.
Right. And, I guess that really just comes through. It sounds very like DEI to me. It's like, it doesn't really it doesn't really make sense to have to like try to diversify it. If someone is attracted to become a counselor, those are the people that you should want in your program. Just folks that are called and are moved to it. Those are going to be the most dedicated, I would think, instead of just trying to get someone because of how they look. That changes the merit based is what I'm trying to say. Is like merit should be first and foremost, especially if I was going to be a client, I would just want someone who is really, has a burning passion to help others. I think that's key. So that is like losing sight of, another thing that came to me is it sounds like social engineering. They decided this is what it's going to do, and now they're going to start figuring out like how to get this to trickle down from the top, and that's exactly what it was. So we don't have to be generous here. I just like to think about I think some listeners might be a little bit more on the progressive side, and so I was trying to give them something, but I just don't think it works out. And I think that if there are listening here, then those are the folks we need them to speak up to their own party and hold them accountable. Just like I think they're extremists and like the Christianity. And I go, hey, if you're a moderate Christian, it's up to you to kind of hold these more extremists in your group accountable, because like we have to help kind of police each other in a good way, not in this cancel culture way, but and helping hold each other to this standard. That's the whole point of ethics. And Stoicism or some of this Buddhism, there's like, the first thing you said is about like, instead of reacting, responding, like good gravy. That's what we want in the world, I would think, is wanting to make sure that instead of me saying something and doing something out of emotional hijack that I regret later, having a skill where I act under extreme difficulty that aligns with my values. So later on, I don't feel bad about it. Like, yeah, that sounds like a win-win. So yeah, very frustrating. And I'm a big fan of DBT. As I wish it got more exposure than CBT. It's like, okay, guys, there's DBT, which I think is really, really helpful. That just distress, say that 5 times fast, distress tolerance skills. I'll link that in the show notes, guys, if you want to know what I'm trying to pronounce. Okay, so in part 2 of your series, you described how counseling programs are shifting from evaluating students based on competence to assessing their willingness to confess, comply, and conform. And so that's how we're slowly going to get to your story and how you even call this ideological purification. Can you walk us through how CACREP's standards have enforced this and what that means for students like you or others who have resisted?
Well, so when we talk about CACREP, and for anybody who's not part of the counseling circles, that is the accreditation body for master's and PhD counseling programs. And if you want to be a counselor, you have to go through one of those programs. And since CACREP is pretty much the only game in town, if you're going to an accredited program, you're going to a CACREP program. And what they do, their role in determining how the program works out is by developing standards. And I've written, that's one of my write-ups about their standards. And I've written several others where I go through practically line by line saying this is what they want. But if you look at their standards, they ask for, starting with the mission statement for each of these master's or PhD programs, to include language that says how they are going to focus on, working with marginalized clients, and, all of the things that they ask for are asking for accommodations for diversity, whether it is in the hiring of the faculty or whether it is in the recruitment for the students. It's in the textbooks, like I said, it's in the mission statements. They have to repeat this stuff in the program manuals. The diversity has to be included throughout the entire program. And what that translates to in terms of the curriculum, you have your ethics textbook, and your ethics textbook has a chapter in there about multicultural counseling. You get to your groups, your groups book has got a chapter about multicultural counseling. And it really comes to like an intensified head when you get to the multicultural counseling class, which is a class that is strictly about that subject and is required in every accredited program across the country. So, and this is affecting over 472 universities, which, totals over 900 different separate degree programs. So that is the role that CACREP is playing there. And because it is so detailed, and because it repeatedly asks for things that are focusing on diversity and focusing on, working with marginalized populations, that they're dropping in this loaded language, when you say marginalized populations, you're specifically referencing the ideology behind critical race theory and these other social justice worldviews associated with multiculturalism that they're trying to slip in there. And if you're surrounded by that at all times and you are expected to respond in your coursework to include those kind of concepts, you can't help but be indoctrinated into thinking about things in terms that include those different separating criteria. And that's how that works.
That makes a lot of sense. And so, for example, for my listeners who might not, I've read a lot more about how this victimization shakes out. So what does that look like? So, for example, what are they trying to say for a counselor? When you're working with someone that is part of these marginalized groups, you're going to be feeding them that all the institutions are against them, or what does that actually look like?
Well, so this is a good question. One of the things that you are taught to do in counseling is what they call broaching. And what that means is that as you have your conversation with your clients, you're trying to eventually circle the subject back to talk about race, where, at some point you bring up, it's like, so, what's it like for you as a, marginalized person to be talking here with me and getting therapy as a privileged person, or, and it's just like, who does that? Why would you inject that into the conversation? And at that point, once you have injected the idea and the question of race, from the counselor standpoint, it's a jumping board to go off into, it's like, oh, so do you think that maybe some of your issues are because you're marginalized, or, just, you can just go into that entire multicultural worldview. And if that is what is baked in as the foundation for how things work, it can't help but come up in your conversation.
Yes. And that is clear as day. If you are hanging out with anybody that is a social justice warrior, it is just all encompassing. It also sounds like they kind of set up an us versus them dichotomy right there when they ask a question like that, which is a little bit strange, I would think, for just the rapport building aspect of the session. That just makes me feel awkward just thinking about it. But, I'm thinking, because we've both read the book about the righteous mind and how he talks a lot about the globalism and versus America first kind of concepts. And so that's where we were trying to give them maybe the benefit of they're trying to be compassionate. They're trying to be understanding of that we are truly a diverse country, but diversity really isn't actually what the goal is. And that's what I guess is, I believe that we're hopefully, and you're part of this, is the cultural shift that we're starting to see. Is the DEI is smoke and mirrors, because it's not actually shaking out to be that way. And then, and there's other people who are Asian populations are, very much turned away due to these elevation of some and suppression of others. Critical race theory is so much about the us versus them. That's all it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the question there is, it's compassionate to whom and in what context? Because obviously, if you're telling a whole nother group, it's like, well, you're too good, so we have to handicap you, like they were doing to Asian folks who were trying to go to the Ivy Leagues. You're not being compassionate there. And there's certainly a lot that they leave out. So it's a very skewed worldview, and it is compassion and care, but it is applied very selectively, and it totally glosses over the punitiveness in which people who fall outside of those groups are treated. I mean, you can be, just treated like utter garbage if you are not part of the selected group, which have been elevated to have this extra special compassion.
Yeah. And the irony there is painful. It's just painful. And I really appreciate how much better you articulated that than I did, which is why I have you here on the show. Thank you for being here. So moving on to the third question I want to talk about, or just part 3, you discuss a little bit more where we're kind of talking about the multicultural counseling courses and critical race theory. We haven't really touched on intersectionality, and we're kind of talking about how social justice activism and intersectionality is a big part of that. And that's part of the victimhood stuff. So can you define a little bit more about that for us?
Yes. So we had a lecture on intersectionality, and it was in my ethics class. And the idea behind it is that people have these various different, I dislike calling them identities, because I don't think of my skin as my identity, or, even my religion or other things like that. They're characteristics, but, for sake of argument, we'll use their language, and they characterize those as different identities. And when you have different ones that come together in the same person, you can have different, if you're the kind of person that follows data a lot, you can see how certain trends may come together to a certain point. So, if you were to have, say, someone who was Black, transsexual, or, I guess transgender is the word they like now, Hindu person, it's like those are there. That's a lot of challenge, because, each one of those can separately of its own be considered a marginalized identity. So for someone who, for example, would otherwise maybe be seen as privileged, maybe because they are white and maybe they're British, if perhaps they were homosexual, then, they've got this intersectionality, this point of victimization. I mean, this is how it ends up playing out, is it's kind of weights and measures for figuring out how much victim credibility you have. And that's because underlying all of this is there's 2 buckets. There's the privileged bucket and there's the marginalized bucket, or sometimes it's called the oppressor and the oppressed bucket. And you never want to be in the privileged or the oppressor bucket. You're there, and, that's if you're white and you're male and you're cisgender, and you're straight and all of that. God help you, because nobody who follows this ideology is going to, because they've decided that those characteristics mean that you can already do anything that you want and that there's no barriers. And where that all comes apart is that's just simply not true. I mean, you come up to Appalachia here and you tell the white folks here that, it's like, yeah, you guys are so privileged, while they're trying to, kind of dig out from under the hurricane.
Right.
It's nonsensical. It's absolutely nonsensical. And it also, the way that it does filter people into these 2 buckets, it inherently puts those groups at odds with each other.
Right. Yeah. And now Asians are white adjacent, Jews are white adjacent, and just the, anti-Semitic rhetoric is insanity to me. Like, I understand war is nasty on both sides, and that, we should be able to criticize Israel for things that we're upset about and not be labeled a name just because we said something. So I see that going on both sides. But Wow, there are some concerns happening. My husband, being the military family, there's been really upsetting seeing them cover the statues in DC with, jihadist gear. My husband's been deployed to Afghanistan twice, and it's just gutting. It's just gutting. The cowardness is heartbreaking to me too. Did you see Matt Walsh's video, his documentary, Am I Racist, that came out last fall?
I've seen some clips of it. I haven't gotten around to watching the whole thing of it yet because, it's just like, okay, where do I find 2 hours to just sit and, watch all at once? But I thought the clips, some of it, my goodness, the one with him, with Robin DiAngelo.
It was the best part of the entire movie. So, I saw it. I went and and if being so busy, thank you for taking the time to sit down with us. And my husband and I saw it in the theaters, and I was still in the deconstruction space, so I was like really quiet about seeing it because I knew I'd be completely kicked out if they knew that I was doing this. But yeah, I was a genius, and I don't agree with Matt Walsh either. I can enjoy people's art and not agree fully with them because I'm trying to live in more of a spectrum-based thinking, which is not easy, but like we have to develop spectrum-based thinking to survive the times that we're in. And so, with keeping time in mind, and I just really appreciate so much of what you're breaking down. I'm very hungry for this concept. So I think your voice is very important. So thank you for all the work and writing that you do. So, now we're going to dive a little bit more, I would like to, into, what you went through with this support plan when, you shared this very powerful statement in class about, instead of reacting, let's respond, that these concepts are what are based in the principles of psychology. So you mentioned in part 4, we have the K-Krebs dispositions. So where students like you were pressured, or there's another student we'll mention earlier who was a Christian, who was pressured to align their values, her values, with beliefs that were these ideological standards that we've been talking about. And so can you share a little bit more about what that support plan looked like? Because in the article you shared, it was very dark time for you. There was verbal abuse. They were trying to force you to say things that were not necessarily true. So would you share whatever you're comfortable with about that?
Yeah, well, the way that it was framed for us early in the semester was it was supposed to be a supportive environment, and it was described, at least for some people, in terms of like say, particularly as people are younger, when you're in your early 20s, I remember being in my early 20s, and if I had to do a lot of self-reflecting, I might not have been, so nice about hearing, well, you're not doing this right. Definitely learned to mature to work my way through that. But for people who were really struggling there, maybe have even to the extent of a narcissistic reaction to it, a very aggressive thing. It was supposed to be a place where that could be managed and massaged with the faculty and the student. That's how it was framed. What I found in practice was that is not what it was. What they were trying to impress on me is that I needed to accept that I was racist, because obviously the color of my skin made me racist. I'm an oppressor, and I should be thanking all of the marginalized people around me for just tolerating my very existence, including my classmates. There was some friction points there with some of them, and it was awful. And at several different points, they felt like they were empowered to tell me what I needed to value and how that should look, how I should be responding and reacting in order to gain their approval. And looking back on it, they have absolutely no right to do that to anyone. But yeah, by the time it got to the end of the semester and they were telling me that I wasn't going to be allowed to advance into practicum, despite the fact that I had all A's and a B plus. Yeah, one of the professors in particular really seemed to be taking some enjoyment in telling me that I was just terrible at counseling skills, and that, my classmates were just humoring me because I was just so bad. They didn't want to tell me these things, and that I was, horrible to my groups leader when I was in the groups by mentioning that when I was a student at UNCG, I had gone to the Woolworths in Greensboro before it closed. And like I was, it was just totally baffling to me, and when I tried to respond, trying to understand, well, what is it that was bad about me going to that? And this particular person would say, that's it right there, you don't know already. And it's just like, what? It was awful. It was really, really awful. And I'm definitely glad that it's over, but it's been highly motivating. If that's what they're teaching, if that's how they're handling students who are trying to learn to be compassionate to everyone, and that should be the job, whether or not you can pull it off with every client and every circumstance, because there are some folks out there who have done some pretty scary things, is another question. But if that's the goal, and you're just tearing your students down, and you're telling them that some are just inherently bad, and others need to be pampered because they're so incompetent they couldn't handle things on their own, they have no resilience. It's just like this whole mentality just breeds more mental illness. It's sort of like going to the doctor and getting bled. This is like, we're going backwards here. This is not helping. This is making people worse.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing a little bit more about what that support plan was like. And I can't imagine while you were in it. Now, in retrospect, you have a little bit more clarity, but there's so much about our identity is wrapped up in the school that you're doing. I mean, your career to be a counselor is, like you were saying, identity. Here I said the word, but I think when we become our profession, whether that's good or bad, I think as a culture, we put our identity in that. Like my identity as a personal trainer, and now that my health is debilitated and I can't work out as much, and I've gained some weight, I'm having like an identity crisis. Like I didn't even think about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't think about getting older. Like, so I think that that's not necessarily in this critical race concept of going to school, building this idea, this dream of what you want to do and accomplish. And then while you're in that mindset, getting all that torn down and getting bullied, I can't imagine how it felt in your heart, how confusing, what it was for your nervous system, how debilitating it was. I mean, it's a cult. That was a cult. It's from someone who's in a religious cult. I'm punching my mic. I'm so upset that being in a religious cult, there's so many similarities there, being like, I had to confess certain beliefs. And if I didn't, then I was completely kicked out. Or if I wasn't baptized a certain way, I wasn't allowed to take communion at that church. They're like, oh no, it's just very, very uncomfortable feeling. And for me, like when we talk more about moral psychology and the evolutional psychology, like when you are being told that you are not accepted and that you're not a part of your group, could be like, it feels life-threatening. And so, you shared a little bit before we push record, but like, what was it like? You said, now that I'm out of it, I'm glad. And, but how was that like getting out of that? Like, what was that transition like for you?
Oh, it was terrible. I mean, while I was going through this, and things obviously took a turn about middle of the semester when they do the evaluations of what they call professional dispositions, as KCREP calls for, several times during the semester. And after they did the mid-semester ones, I was called in. And I was told that one of my professors said that I was transphobic, and that another one said that my thinking was too concrete. And I needed to get those things together, or I was going to end up with this support plan. And once that pressure was applied to me, I'm really starting to get scared that I'm not going to, I thought that I was doing good work, but it was hard because I hadn't been back to school for about 30 years. I'm still trying to figure out, how do I use this stupid PowerPoint thing, and make these little slides. And, in addition to reading the material and trying to write on a regular basis, and still, take care of some of my responsibilities at home. It was quite a lot. And, the thought that my thinking was at issue was like, how do you even fix that? I remember at the time, thinking, what do they mean by concrete thought? And I'm there on my iPad, looking up what do they mean by what is concrete thinking? What does that look like? And I'm thinking like, well, how is that a problem? And if it's a problem, how do you change it? And should you change it? And all of these questions, while at the same time, I'm trying to get the coursework done. It's like, okay, do I focus my attention on this concrete thinking problem, or do I do my papers? What am I supposed to do here? And it became very pressurizing. And, I'm having little moments where I'm getting more negative feedback from my professors, and, having negative feedback in my small group, and very quickly feeling alienated from my classmates and from the rest of the group. And yet that's where I'm spending all of my time, because I'm on my off days, I'm at home, but I'm working on that material, and then I'm going in and having to deal with that on the regular. And after a certain point, I'm crying. I'm going to my morning classes. I'm making it through my morning classes. I go and, have lunch and cry a bit, and then go to my afternoon classes. And then, I just cry as I'm driving myself home. And it's just, it's a nightmare. It was a nightmare. And no degree, no career should require that as a condition to make it through. You shouldn't, I can understand where, if you are going to be in a profession where you're going to be delivering psychotherapy to clients, it can be helpful to have had that experience. But the emotional pressure of going should not be the requirement. You should not have to go to counseling because your coursework is so pressurizing that it is destroying your mental health. That's not okay. That's
not okay.
That's a problem.
Well, yeah, they were breaking down your core sense of identity. Like the good, like this, not critical race theory, like the identity and like the psychology concept, or the ego. I don't even know, because I don't study all those principles. So I don't even feel comfortable saying ego, because I don't even know what that means. But your self, your sense of self, like that's what happens in cults. That's for me, like so many of my values. That's why a lot of my friends from Portland, when they saw me fall into this fundamentalist Christian cult, they're like, huh? Like I did have to put away a lot of myself, and that's what they were asking you to do. And that's death. You were dying on the inside. And I can imagine from my own experience what that was like, but I truly can't, because of the investment financially, just with the time away from family and chores and all of that. So one of my last questions was this ideological enforcement. It affects this kind of professional integrity, and that's kind of what you were feeling. It was the death. And what do you think that means for the future of counseling, like as a field, if students are forced to coerce into adopting these values? And I guess before we go there, because I guess the story, like, pause, I just asked you a question, and now let me not. We didn't mention Jennifer Keaton, because she's a great example of this. This happened in Georgia, right? Because yeah. And do you want to explain a little bit about what happened to her? And then we could talk about how it was with you and with her, and like, what does that look like for the future if this is what's happening?
Yeah, her case happened around 2011, and she was at the University of Augusta in Georgia, and she had issue with she was a devout Christian, and she had issue with having to treat clients who were homosexual regarding their homosexuality. So this is my understanding. And she wanted to be able to defer clients who wanted to talk about those things. And, she probably would have had no issue talking to them about depression or something else, but she was specific about that issue, that she was not comfortable treating them in the way that they were asking her to. And the university said that she needed to go to re-education to fix those Christian views of hers. And she objected to that. And she got lawyers and they filed suit. The ACLU, her suit was on discrimination grounds, if I recall correctly. The ACLU got involved and they backed the school, and they cited the ACA Code of Ethics, saying that she was not allowed to have her own views and express her own views in this context, and that she should have to go to re-education camp and divorce her views and her beliefs and take on these multicultural beliefs and toe that line. And so she ended up, the courts sided with the university based on the ACA Code of Ethics at the time, and she lost the suit, and the judgment stands at this point.
It comes down to, she was trying to protect her right to free speech, her religious freedom, and her right of conscience. And so I think it's only fair. It's like, as a personal trainer, there's a lot of reasons why I would hand off a client. Of course, there's not as much regulation and oversight in personal training, which some debate there should be. I'm not a fan of regulation as a libertarian, but I do also see the benefit of it when it comes to our food systems or the environment. So I totally understand. And so while you and I might not agree with her beliefs, we still live in a country that was founded on freedom of religion. And so coming back to my question that I asked, like, what is this? If students are forced to adopt these values and give up their own personal integrity or give up their own conscience, what's that look like in the future? Like, how is that going to support anybody?
Yeah, I don't think that looks good at all. I mean, I agree that it is very cult-like, and the way that I see the profession under that context moving in that way, they're trying to use the therapy space, the client space and time to communicate these multicultural values. And you can look at the documented record going back to 1988, where that particular set of values were put in motion. And that's what they said that they wanted to use the counseling space to impress on clients that they needed to accept multiculturalism as a value. And here we are. And that is what this program is doing. It's forcing the practitioners to take up this value, and they can't help but take it in to the counseling space. If you're teaching people how to broach the subject of race while they're in therapy and the client hasn't brought that up, how is that not imposing your value, the value of multiculturalism, on the client? Explain that. Somebody explain that, because that doesn't make any sense to me. And what you see is, despite the fact that there are so many people in therapy now, 100 years ago, no therapy nor no these problems. And what you see today, more people in therapy, more people saying that they have mental health problems, despite the fact, 100 years ago, people were still dealing with, high infant death rates and, communicable diseases that we did not have vaccines for, and, no antibiotics and all of this other stuff. And people were happier. Clearly there's a disconnect here. There's something that, and I think it's fairly obvious to see how these changes in the counseling field contribute to these problems. because they're doing all of the things that we know make people feel more unhappy. You take away their autonomy. You encourage them to feel like they are helpless to do anything to improve their situation. And, then you teach them how to ruminate over small behaviors that somebody else did, these microaggressions. We're training people to, think like they are, paranoid and scared all the time and incompetent. And this is just, for me, this whole process, this whole way of teaching and thinking it's malpractice.
Yeah.
I don't know any other way to put it, but that's what they're training is. This is how we do, mental health malpractice and make it look like we're doing good therapy because that's what we're calling it. And I think it's unethical, and I'm not comfortable with that. And if I have the power to stop it, I would. All I can do is speak up and say, I don't think this is okay. And people, and at a minimum, people should know exactly what they're signing up for if they are going in, that this is what they are going to get. Because I don't think that at a minimum there is not, informed consent here, because people are not made aware of these underlying values that counselors are being trained in.
Yeah. And that was what I wanted to speak about because, I wanted to kind of circle back around because in the very beginning of the conversation, you mentioned how this ideological capture, I believe you mentioned this because I've read so much of your work. I believe you said this, that it's eroding the core fundamental ethical principles of psychology. And that's why I'm glad you mentioned informed consent, because I'm very, very, very passionate about informed consent and medical freedom. And so, like you said, clients who are going to be, okay, well, you mentioned if you're going to enroll in these courses, you should know what you're doing. Yes. But also clients like me who are, young, vulnerable, who have, emotional abuse, neglect, physical abuse, and we're put into therapy, it's very easy to be pathologized and be victim and to all of a sudden be more anxious and more depressed, which is what we're seeing, whether that's, the social justice informed therapy or instead of what we're saying is these counselors, whether they want to or not, are being forced to offer a specific worldview instead of offering a full range of perspectives. And the other thing that we mentioned in the coddling of American mind, there's 3 great untruths. So I mentioned one of them, your feelings are facts. But the other one is that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And instead of makes you stronger, because when we look back at all the ancient wisdom that we get from, Eastern religions or Stoicism or Jonathan Haidt has a book on the happiness hypothesis, which I haven't read yet, but in my queue, because this is what he talks about, is that there's so much good advice and wisdom that we have from many, many, many thousands of years of written or oral traditions. And this goes against all of that. And if you push back against this narrative, you are labeled harmful, you are labeled regressive, or even worse. And so you're right. I do think that this is malpractice. I think this is unethical. I think it's potentially dangerous, and it's tearing our country apart. And in closing, you mentioned that you're seeing some noticeable changes from your work. I saw like a recent post about that. Like, you mentioned like if I can do anything, which you are. So what are you noticing? Because in the communities that you're in, any changes are brewing?
Well, what I've been noticing is that more people are talking about it. So at the time when I first started talking about it, there was myself, and there was Leslie Elliott Leslie Elliott Voice now, and maybe 1 or 2 other figures who were talking about this in the counseling field. Aaron Kinesvater, he was another one, and it's a kind of a small group of people. And here recently, there have been more therapists who are coming out and saying, there are some problems in this field. And I think that is I think that's a great step. And, I think that the steps that need to follow that is, I'm not sure right now whether it is going to be possible or whether it makes sense to try and extract this from the KCREP and the ACA, or whether it makes sense to build something new. But I think that the energy to do one of the two is building. And I think that that is great news for clients, because people need to have somewhere that they can go and talk in a safe way as they're trying to figure things out. And, now more than ever, because everything just feels so crazy, if we can't find a common place where we can discuss our differences and our fears and our concerns, so that we can, go back to our lives and, have the courage that we need to have, that's bodes poorly for all of our other challenges right now. But I am seeing these shifts, and I think that that is very positive. I mean, I think it's too early to say anything super concrete, but I am noticing that there are more people coming out, and I find that very, very encouraging.
Yes, I'm sure you do. Well, I would like to say in closing is that I have, even in the book Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier, which I think it starts good conversations, but I'm not a big fan of the book, actually, for other reasons. But no one is articulating the root of the problem like you are. People want to talk about it. They want to complain about it and complain about the victimhood narratives, but no one is going to the ethic workbooks and reading through 420 plus different things like you are. I've never seen it. I don't know. And not to put you up on a pedestal or anything, but your work explained it so much more. It could go into the root, the source of it. So just thank you so much. And I'll look up, I haven't heard of any of the other names that you mentioned. So I'll look them up and add them into the show notes for our listeners who might want to, maybe they're familiar. I'm still new to this. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope that you can pick up on how grateful I am for it and how much I learned. And I could literally talk to you all day, but we won't do that. Is there anything you'd like to add in closing down the conversation?
I guess, for the people out there who, need therapy, or they need somebody to connect with right now, just be aware that there are healthy places to connect. They might not look exactly like you expect. You can reach out to someone who maybe in your circle who has a reputation for being a good listener. Look in your church, look in different places, that no matter what is happening within the profession right now, it is still possible for people to connect with each other and to help each other. And at the end of the day, we're all here because we have ancestors that survived way worse than this. And if they can do it, we can do it.
Yes, yes, I really appreciate that. And I did already have linked how to find mental health care in an ideologically captured field, something you wrote in summer of 2024, thinking that might be a good resource, kind of practical tips for our listeners. So I'll have that linked in the show notes. And with that, I think we'll close down the conversation. Thank you guys for listening. And that's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for taking the time to listen. And if you can engage with this podcast or Substack in any way, that would be really helpful, whether you're going to leave a comment on the episode or leave a 5-star rating or review or like or comment if it's a blog post. I just really appreciate that. That helps get it out to more listeners, to more people. And that's the whole point of me trying to put out my ideas, my thoughts, these concepts, is to have some sort of conversation. So we are closing down season 3. Can you believe it? We've got a couple more interviews for you that I'm really excited about. We're going to be talking about calories in, calories out, or you might know it as move more, eat less, that typical advice on how to lose weight and why it is not only incorrect, but also misleading. I'm really excited about that interview. And then we also have a closing down the interview for my 40th birthday on April 15th. It's going to be a special episode. That's still a secret, and I can't wait. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a beat. And thanks again. And until then, maintain your curiosity, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a good week.